I'm going to bring up Lynn back to introduce our main program. Lynn is the Chief Development Officer of Plymouth Housing Group. And did you know that Lynn spent 16 years in real estate as General and Marketing Manager at the Pacific Place Shopping Center? So fun fact about Lynn, she loves to travel, and she and her husband, Creed, are going to venture to Buenos Aires in the spring. And she just moved downtown Seattle, and so her commute is a lot less. It's a 10-minute walk to work, so she pinches herself every day. So please, let's give Lynn a nice Seattle applause.
Thanks, Cindy. It's an honor for me to introduce Steve Metruck, Executive Director of the Port of Seattle. And today, Steve is going to share with us what the port does and why it matters. There's no doubt about it. Steve has a big job. He leads a county-wide special purpose government responsible for providing world-class trade, travel, and logistics services to one of our nation's fastest-growing regions. The port manages operations for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, as well as cruise, commercial fishing, grain terminals, recreational marinas, and other real estate activities. As executive director, Steve leads 1,900 employees. The Port of Seattle is one of Pacific Northwest's leading economic engines, generating over 216,000 jobs and $894 million in state and local taxes. Steve came to the Port of Seattle following a 34-year career with the U.S. Coast Guard, retiring as Rear Admiral. Steve has a bachelor's degree in ocean engineering from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and a master's degree in public administration from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Also joining us for lunch today is Steve's wife, Peggy Duxbury. Wave, Peggy. Peggy and I were chatting earlier this week so I could add some fun facts to Steve's Rotary introduction. I don't know if you were expecting that. I learned that Steve is one of 6 children and was raised in upstate New York. He grew up watching the big trading ships on the St. Lawrence Seaway, which inspired his interest in the Coast Guard. After retiring from the Coast Guard, Steve went on a month-long trek in Nepal, including the Mount Everest Base Camp. He also competed in a half Ironman triathlon. Both Peggy and Steve love the outdoors and are thrilled to be in Seattle, where they are surrounded by the mountains and water. We're lucky to have both of them here in our city. And now let's give a warm Seattle 4 Rotary welcome to Steve Metruck.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that Lynn covered basically all my talking points, so I don't have to go on much over there about what's going on at the port. But first off, thanks for having me here today. It's very exciting to be here back in Seattle Rotary number 4. There's lots of things going on here in the region, and what I want to talk about with that, related to that, there's so much going on with growth here. There's also a lot going on with the port, and I'm going to touch on some of those things here today. But I do want to say thanks, Lynn, for that introduction, and because I'm going back, I'm just coming up on a year, so it'll be a year February 1st since I started, at least started on the payroll of the port. I was doing work before that. But in the meantime, when I came out for multiple interviews, it was in Lynn and Creed's basement where I was staying as I was here. So it just brings me back to that now. I want to say is that the big thing here is that there's a lot of things going on at your Port of Seattle, because it's your Port of Seattle, because if I went around the room here, everyone in this room is touched by the activities of the port, whether it's through travel or whether it's through imports or exports, or just somebody else who does business with the port, or even eats seafood from the Pacific Northwest. That's all interacted and all has interactions with the port. So before we do that, I'm just going to say a little bit more about myself. And I got to look for the clicker because that was my responsibility to bring it up with me, Ken, and it's in my pocket somewhere. So let's see if that works. And so I spent 34 years in the Coast Guard, and some of the best times that I had were here in the Pacific Northwest from 2005, 2008, when I was responsible for Coast Guard operations here, and it really brought us back, Peggy and myself, back here at the Pacific Northwest. This is a picture of the Eagle when the Eagle, the nation's tall ship, was here, and we got to bring her into Elliott Bay, and it was a very fantastic day to do that. But to go back there, this is when we were unpacking. The routes going back to Seattle are much farther, even though I did grow up in northern New York. I came across this when we were unpacking, which is a postcard issued when I was here as a cadet in 1978, when the Coast Guard Eagle was tied up at Pier 70. We work at Pier 69, and we were tied up in 1970 at the pier next to us. And this postcard was was issued at that time with a stamp of the Eagle, but it just shows, it was just funny. I came across this unpacking things in the garage of that connection back to that day, and actually the 40th anniversary of that was this summer on August 4th on Coast Guard Day. Anyway, I thought that was interesting to me to see that change and that connection. Who knew that 40 years later I'd be here back one pier away and in charge of the port. So the port, I don't know if everybody knows how the port is organized. Lynn mentioned a special purpose government. Special purpose government set up under the oversight of 5 elected commissioners, and one of those commissioners, and then I work for them. So it's always great to work for 5 elected officials at one time. It's fantastic. But we're not just an organization or a business. We have a public service mission as a special purpose government, and we have a triple bottom line. You know, we want to succeed as a business. However, we also want to do it in the most sustainable way possible. For us, that's being the most sustainable port in Northern America. And we also want to spread economic prosperity in an equitable way throughout the community. So it's that triple bottom line that attracted me to this job, and not just another business or some other business where profit is the bottom line. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's not my role of what I did for 34 years of my life. There's another part of governance here also, is that one of the things that came back was one of the great things that happened was with our main competitor as a port, the Port of Seattle set up an alliance with the Port of Tacoma. So here for the region, we have the 2 major competitors no longer competing against each other, cooperating to make investments and sharing revenues. And with them, they created the 4th largest port in the nation as far as cargoes go. And this governance is part of together. Oh, geez, I'm not doing very good on this. Working together with the port commissioners from Tacoma, those serve as managing members for this alliance that looks at all the cargo coming into Puget Sound and making the investments on the facilities that need those with that. So really, the port, the way I like to describe it, is looking at it as a different way. The Port of Seattle is responsible for managing and operating our 2 gateways to the global economy, on maritime and on aviation. And making those gateways, and we do this through our maritime operations, where we're the 4th largest, as I mentioned, in cargo operations, and then Sea-Tac, where we're the 9th busiest airport in the nation. As a lot of people know, we've been growing on that list. And our focus is on maintaining investments to make sure that we maintain this conductivity to the global economy. You know, we're doing well, but we have to continue to meet demands due to growth in the region. But it also means we have to remain competitive because, especially on the maritime side, we have many competitors, including to the north of us in Canada and then down in Southern California as well. We do this. In doing this, we have a major impact on the region. First, by providing aviation and maritime transportation services, that's both through ships and through aircraft, delivering people and goods. We do that both the businesses and residents depend upon for moving through. And secondly, through jobs, including construction jobs while we're carrying out our work to do that. And we provide the local and economic activity that ripples throughout the economy, both locally and regionally and probably statewide. The airport alone is among the largest employers, worksite employers in King County, with over 22,000 employees out at Sea-Tac alone. More than half of our budget goes to capital development, which also drives our economic development, major economic development as well. And in fact, we plan to spend over $3 billion in capital, on capital over the next 5 years. Looking at the Maritime Gateway, specifically, it has 4 major components that you see here. The Seaport Alliance, which I was just talking about with cargo, maritime industrial lands and innovation, home port of the North Pacific fishing fleet, and the largest cruise terminal on the West Coast, cruise operations. These are the major components of our maritime operations. But, on some of these, you think about fisheries, that's our past, that's our present, but it's also our future across all these components of that. Last November, the Port Commissioners approved funding plan, my first budget. Cindy, we were just talking about, you don't know until you go through the budget cycle. This wasn't interesting. I also was the CFO for the Coast Guard, so I know a little bit about budget cycles, and it was interesting to go through the first budget cycle here. And we approved one of the most ambitious budgets we've had in a while. But part of that is over $300 million investment over the next period of 5-year period. And these large investments, these will be the largest investments that we made in over a generation. Is really a maritime renaissance in some aspects to do that. We're also working very closely with the state, with Governor Inslee and his Maritime Blue Initiative. It's an effort to accelerate innovation and economic development across our maritime industry, keeping it sustainable at the same time, but also tapping into the spirit of innovation that's here in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm just going to talk about a few highlights of these. And I know that Ken is watching that clock very closely before we get to the questions. So, that it's coming back to here and really looking at the ports of Seattle and Tacoma are very unique, and as all ports throughout Washington State is that they're not only focused on imports, like the ports of LA and other ports are focused on imports, but here in the state of Washington, we have a very robust export economy, and that's both on the high-tech side, which is high-tech products from our high-tech industries, to agricultural side, to making sure that those products from Eastern Washington have a gateway to find their way both through aviation and through maritime to get to those markets overseas. 40% of the economy of Washington State is trade dependent, or trade. I wouldn't say dependent, but impacted by trade. And so that's a strong economy, and we know that the gateways that we have here in the Port of Seattle are important to making that happen. The trend is always increasing with growth, and that's no different when you look at cargo ships that come in here. And you see the big cranes, I don't know, when you drive in, you can't see that anymore from the viaduct. You used to have great views from the viaduct of looking at those views, but maybe from the city of seeing the large ships coming in carrying containers. These are called 20-foot equivalent units. I'll just call them containers for this, but as you see here in the slide, but these the ships. The trend internationally is towards larger ships with getting economy scales, putting more containers on these ships. So the real focus for the Alliance in the Port of Seattle, is our part in that, is to accommodate these larger ships. And you can see this is that some of these ships now, even though the ones that usually come in were like 9,000 containers, soon they'll be at 18,000 containers. And you have to build the capacity to offload these. Your docks have to be able to accommodate that, and your depth of your channels has to be deep enough to have that. And we're lucky to we're on the precipice of being ready for all of those. And that includes Terminal 5, which is the terminal that's closest to West Seattle. For those, I live in West Seattle, and I see it every day as I go in and see great things when I look at it, because that's coming to life here pretty soon. We're making investments in T5, which is the most capable dock. It also has on-dock railroad connections, which takes more trucks off the road. The more containers that you put onto rail, it makes it efficient to move the containers off, and that is more sustainable and less impact on the environment as you do that. So that's coming to life. We're making the investment there, and that's soon. The announcement is coming out pretty soon. But it really is that in Terminal 18, which is kind of in the middle with Harbor Island there. These terminals will give us that capacity to deal with these larger ships and make us competitive with the rest of these markets, to make sure that we're maintaining the great jobs that come from this. The average job in the maritime industry related to cargo is $95,000 per year, which is a great wage to work on, and there's lots of jobs that are related to this and executing this. The next thing I want to talk about is economic development and innovation. You know, supporting all this maritime industry, you have a large number of businesses, and then related to both cargo and commercial fishing businesses, they generate lots of demand for services. You know, so you have a lot of small businesses that support these larger businesses in doing this, and then we actually build and develop. Dave McFadden of Rotary 4 here, your own right here, is responsible for economic development, and he does that. And part of our plan coming up is to do the largest development that we've had since the 70s in our areas here, which is this area, this Inner Bay area between Magnolia and Queen Anne, and making the investment here for light industrial areas, again, bringing the jobs and the work that's needed to support the maritime industry. And that's coming here, and this is actually called Pier 91. If you look where the cruise ships are there near LA Bay Marina, if you don't know what that is. And that's also where the fishing vessels, the larger fishing vessels, pull up there as well. I'll talk about more of that in a second. The other exciting thing for us on the maritime side is the development of cruise. You know, this year we'll celebrate the 20th anniversary of cruise into Seattle. And so that means we had 0 in 1998. We now have over 1 million passengers a year, with over 200 vessels coming in, with a multiplier for each vessel call in the economy of about $2.7 million per vessel call as it comes into the port. But we also want to do it in a sustainable way as well, looking at ways to have ships, when they come in, to cold iron, to plug in, so that they go on shore power, so they're not using emissions from their generators when they're at shore. But this is one of the big impacts for tourism, not on here, but we also are working to develop that for the rest of we want, when people come to take cruises in the Pacific Northwest, on these Alaskan cruises, we also want them to spend time looking at the rest of Washington State. And that's a big focus of ours, and that's Dave's work as well as under tourism. And also, with the development of the T5 cruise, or the development of the T5 cargo terminal, there's an opportunity for us to put a 4th berth in right now for cruise and add higher demand. Now, the demand, if you look at demand for cruise over the years, it continues to go up. And on everyone's bucket list, research tells us that a trip from Seattle to Alaska is #1 in the trips that people want to take, and we want to be able to serve that demand to do that. And so we're looking at adding a 4th berth here in Seattle to meet that demand. And first we have to wait for cargo to work out on the Terminal 5 announcement, and then we'll go forward looking to how to increase our cruise opportunities here, and the multipliers throughout the economies of not just Seattle region, but all throughout the state to do that. Next, I want to talk about one of the more historic parts, which is not aviation, but is fishing. You know, statewide, as you can see here, the commercial fishing enterprise produced $10 billion in business revenue for here. And it actually is one of the few sustainable fisheries in the world, the Pacific Northwest, that goes up into Alaska, and the fishing down there, fishing up there, and all its impacts on us here. You know, I don't know if people know that or tell when the visitors come. That is out of the Fisherman's Terminal, one of the oldest terminals that exists to do that. And the fleets go out of there and bring back all that economic activity back to the Pacific Northwest. And we're making investments on the docks there to make sure that this is vibrant, not just today, but in the future to do that. And that includes the larger ships, the family-owned businesses to the larger corporation-owned businesses. But it's one of the great businesses here of the Pacific Northwest. A lot of that is exported as well. It's not just for domestic use. All right, Ken. So we're going to keep moving here under thing that probably touches everybody the most, which is Sea-Tac, which is your gateway to the world. You know, there's over 90 domestic and 28 nonstop international flights from Sea-Tac, so it really is that gateway. So it's both a destination port. I'm looking at fishing. Thanks to my wife. I should put her in charge of the clicker. So it's both, so we're both a destination, but we're also that gateway to both ways. Now, we added, just last year, you can see the flights that we added last year to Europe. You know, it only takes 6 hours probably to fly to Newark. For a few more hours, you can get to Europe. So I don't know whether I'd rather go to Europe or to London for a few hours more. But that connection directly, we're hearing it from the countries in Europe, want to be connected to the Pacific Northwest, and Asia wants to connect to us as well. And that's why we're making our investments. You can see here is that for the projects we have going up, this is to meet our demand now, which last year was 46.7 million passengers a growth of, in the last 10 years, from where we were at 28 million, we're continuing to grow. So these are the major projects you see in Central Terminal. Everybody comes in to see that, where you see development of our airport dining and retail options there. And also the big thing, that's coming in 19, will be completed, parts of that. And then our international arrivals facility is where you come into. In our international arrival, we hear this all the time, we know we need to do better on that. I can see some nodding of heads. But we're working on that, and this investment that we have of almost $1 billion to be completed in 2020 is coming under fruition. It's rising, and a lot's been done since I was looking at the mud last year about this time. I was looking at a big hole in the ground, and now we see a facility rising us up that we just put the last piece of steel in place a month ago. So that's coming on the International Arrivals Facility, which will be a showpiece for us. We're also rebuilding North Satellite. There, adding the gates there. And also, big thing for me as being an engineer, you heard that, is the baggage. How's the magic happen to get the baggage to where you want to be? We're spending a lot of money to make sure that that can happen. So here's the thing we're dealing with, though. And one of the messages I want to leave you with is that the growth of the airport is the growth of the region, right? We're trying to meet the money that we're spending now, today, $3 billion. It's to meet the demand that we have now for Sea-Tac. It was 46.7 million passengers in 17, but we think we thought at 5%, we believe at 6% in 18, and now we're looking at 19 continued growth. We thought it would level off, but the demand is still here in the region, and we're working to meet that demand. So for us, we have our next part of meeting that demand is our Sustainable Aviation Master Plan, which is a series of 30 different projects, additional gates to do that, and also different configurations to make arrivals to do that. And actually, I have to say, is we're going to be trying to discouraging people from driving to the airport and driving a single person to pick up, because I think that's the least unsustainable way of doing that. But we're looking at whole things of how do we meet this demand through additional gates, 19 additional gates, cargo facilities, and as I was saying, 30-some projects. And right now, we're in the environmental review for that. And anybody who's in development knows that that's potentially the most difficult session to get through is the environmental review of any project. And we're into that right now. And so here's the timeline as we go forward for us to complete our environmental review and then go forward from there with the projects, but we're deep into that process right now. So with that, that's really where the future lies for us. We're making the investments, we're making the capital investments because from my view of doing the previous job with my previous organization that's your future, is your investments that you make now. So those investments that we're making both in the maritime and aviation are things that are going to serve us for the next generation and then hopefully beyond, because the port's over 100 years old right now, and we expect to be around for at least another 100 years, if not longer. So the last thing I want to leave you with is also just kind of my view of the world as how it fits together, which is that we have cross-cutting programs, and for those within that is that we need to have, for us, safety and resiliency is the top to do that. Then security. Then making sure we are an adaptive organization. I've heard about innovation around our table and our discussion of doing that. Doing it in the most sustainable way possible, the most fiscal way possible. Our CFO is here, so he's responsible for him to keep us fiscally compliant. And do it the most equitable way possible as well, spreading those values across our organization, but in our interaction with the community as well, in order to meet the needs of the community today and into the future. So I think the takeaway would be there's lots of opportunities if you want to be involved. There's different ways to do that. We love to hear the support. We love feedback on our operations, either at the airport or how we can make things better, or support for our efforts to optimize the footprint that we have at Sea-Tac to do that, and support for us as we go forward. So anyway, working with that is just looking forward to working with all of you. And just remember, it's your Port of Seattle. It's not, it's not our Port of Seattle. It's everyone's Port of Seattle to do that. So thanks, and I look forward to answering your questions.
We got a question right here. Jeff Borick, thanks for joining us today. If we were in the other Washington and you could comment to the executive or congressional branch on the impact of shutdowns, what would you want to share with them as it relates to the port?
Well, there's two things that, when you were going to say Washington, I thought it was going to be the tariff question, which I had some slides on that. There's so many other things that the port does, but tariffs are impacting us. But I would say is that the shutdown, here, the port was proactive through the commission to reach out to show support for TSA and the other workers at the airport. They actually created a food bank. They brought together a bunch of banks and other resources that people could need, and it actually kept us. We didn't drop down the TSA screeners that they had at other airports. So it showed the support here from the Pacific Northwest. But really, it's when you look at a system. And you're saying that I have a problem now. If you let those problems continue, if you don't pay somebody, I don't know how an FAA controller, which I think was part of the reason that broke this, was how can FAA controllers that are worried about putting food on their table or how they're going to pay their bills concentrate on their jobs, on safety and security. So I think things get worse, and I hope we don't go back down that. I hope more reasonable approaches come to this, not holding the budget hostage over that to work out some things. But that is, safety and security only gets worse as time goes on if those individuals aren't being paid.
Next question here from Steve Crane.
What is the impact, as you foresee it, for the larger ships? Does that hold a risk in terms of having the Panama Canal become a much more feasible way to get to Asia from the east?
I mean, I'm sorry, you mean the threat from the Panama Canal expand?
Large ships going
Yeah.
from Asia to the East Coast, yes.
Yeah, for sure it is. I mean, we're seeing the expansion. Again, this is the alliance work, but it's the expansion of that. I've seen actually us slide down in Savannah, jump ahead of us as far as the container activity. So it's that competition. One of the more important things to know is that it's actually cheaper, and the Canadians are part of that too, because with nationalized rail, it's actually cheaper for each, somewhere between $200 or $400 per container to send it to Prince Rupert to get to Chicago than it is to come from Seattle. So we have to add value for that. But it is a risk for us. That's why we have to work hard, and we have to have the capacity, because this is where lines are going to larger, more economical ships to move cargo.
We got a question from Todd Sommerfeld. In the last few years, I'm noticing comparing Vancouver to Seattle. Same destination in Europe, same route in US dollars. Seattle's like 20 to 25% more expensive. Why is that?
I can't. That would be the carrier. You're talking about the airlines, right? An airline carrying. On airline pricing, I don't know of how that, I can't, that's done through the airlines. I can't explain that. I've seen that, I grew up next to northern New York, and at times it was cheaper to fly to Canada as it was to, but then it seemed to go back and forth. And I don't know where we are. It seems if it's less expensive, I don't really have an explanation for that right now.
Next question from Virginia McKenzie.
Hi, I noticed that Port of Seattle, it has a public awareness campaign regarding human trafficking. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Sure, that was one of the things. I mean, there's so many things going on within the port. That was one of the things that I dropped off. But it's an active campaign that we just met with and had a great participation in that, which is, these gateways, especially for aviation, it's awareness, whether it be the crews of the aircraft to do that, but we have it's signage, making sure, and then resources, and then a system to respond to that as well, is calling 911 and developing that. It's an education program for the workforce, right? Everybody that works at the airport should know the signs of that and looking into that. So it's really something that the commission believes in, that all of us at the port believe in, to do that. It's really important for us. Thanks for bringing that up.
Bill Hammond has a question over here.
I was wondering what the status of Payne Field is and how that relates to your overall projections.
Yeah, Payne Field, I was up there a little while ago. It's going to be a great operation when it opens up, but there's no way that they can accommodate the growth. We're happy. We're not competitors with them. We welcome them to open up as much traffic as they can receive. but it's not going to meet the demand. You know, we have to continue on. We have to complete our projects and our optimization plans, both that we have underway now and our ones under our Sustainable Aviation Master Plan. But there's no way that they can meet the growth numbers that were on the slide here to do that. And then you know, it's interesting, but of course they couldn't open because of the shutdown, because they couldn't get the inspections in order to get up in operation.
Hey, so I'm a little bit curious about the tariffs and how they could potentially impact our local economy, given that we are so trade dependent, and how you foresee that playing out.
Well, it plays out, I mean, that's my background, was operational safety and security, and looking at it as a layered defense. It's a layered defense for both the cargo or passenger ships. There's regulations in place there. The regulations that are in place at the airport is a layered defense to look at that. I mean, there's always risk there, and I think that we just have to continue to be focused on that. You know, everybody remembers the unfortunate event that took place on August 10th, I believe, the Horizon aircraft that was picked up there. But that person was actually was a badged individual who was working that day and then got around to taking that. But we're working on an international, we're working nationally with all the airports in order to work together to make sure that we have regimes that are addressing that problem, but also other problems of insider threat, which is one of the things that was there, which was insider threat.
Faith Arlen's got a question right here.
Yes, I'd like you to comment on how much we pay in taxes versus how much revenue is generated by the business of the port. Because a lot of times I hear people complain about their taxes, and I just like to...
So out of your county taxes, it's 1.1% of the county, of the... 1% of the total taxes. On the average family, it's $70 per year, and it's the smallest amount of all the things and the money that can be spent on. I have to say the airport is completely paid for, except for small things relating to the environment and some other things, by the airport, by the airlines in itself. So it's self-funding there. What we use it primarily is for environmental programs, you know, non-revenue programs. So that's where non-revenue programs and like environmental and then community programs is primarily where we'd like to use the funds from the tax levy. So I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you.